Hello watercolor artist friends! Are you so excited to paint? Well, I want to give like a rundown on how I learned how to watercolor, and I wish there was someone that taught me like the basics of this is what you're going to need to know when it comes to playing with watercolor. And it doesn't matter what color pigment, except for I wouldn't use yellow, use a darker pigment, and I would do this exercise with every single pigment I had, just so I know. It's kind of like once you have the tools in your toolbox, you know how to use them, right? So this is your tools in your toolbox. So what I like to start off with each student is just playing with the medium. Get used to your pigment. Every pigment works differently, and so when we know how our pigments work, we're able to play with our pigments even more. But I'm going to show you 8 different techniques how I like to use in my cards, in my watercolor, that has really helped me grow as an artist, including water to pigment ratio. It's really hard to teach that and to learn it, so why not practice every time you can your water to pigment ratio? It will really help you grow as an artist. Your soft lines and your hard lines, edges, will really be a big help. Once I learned that, I felt like the sky was the limit, and so on and so forth. So anyways, follow me. It's going to be a great little lesson, and I can't wait to share with you some of my tips and techniques on how to paint. And all you really need is I just found a white lid. It was probably from like a prescription vial, but anything that's white. You could use a pie pan or, you know, like a ceramic plate, but really you don't need very much. And then you just need 2 colors that are like in the same side of the color wheel. I use purple for everything except for this variegated wash, and then you want a different color for that. And then I like using a round brush, but again, you can use any brush that you want, because this is just practice. But I do like using a round brush. This is an actual liner or a script brush, and it's a size 6, but you can use a round brush just fine. And then and a pencil, I just used a 9x12 sheet of paper, and I drew the line in half, and then I went in half again, and then I quartered it. And that's where I got my 8 different groups of techniques. Anyways, follow along with me. It's going to be fun. I really think that this is going to be a great way to jumpstart your watercolor adventure, and we'll see you in the studio. Okay, so first I would like to go with different water and pigment ratio. That might not seem like a big deal, but I tell you what, it's hard to teach, and it's even harder to master, so I thought I would start with that. So what I mean is, watercolor has different properties, and if you were to say you want your value to be dark, how do you get that dark value when watercolor is translucent, right? When you can see the paper. Well, it depends on how your water to pigment ratio is. Right now, from the tube, it's very thick, right? Like it is butter. Like I just have my brush a bit damp, and I can just pick this up, and this is what I would call butter. It's very thick. I mean, you can barely see the paper, right? But if I were to take the same thing and add a bit more water to the pigment like this, now it's going to be more of a milk, so you can still see the paper, and that's still pretty thick, so you could even just take some of that out. But that's more like a milk consistency where you can kind of see the paper, but it's not as thick as butter. And tea is if you were to add very little bit of pigment, so you can barely see it, just like a tea consistency, as if you were to paint with tea, just like that. And so that's the different variations of how you can get value in your watercolor. And mastering this with each different watercolor tube of watercolor, or even palette of watercolor, will help you so much. Alright, so let's go on to edges. Edges can really make or break your watercolor, and what I mean by that is, if I were to paint a heart, or we'll just do a line, it doesn't even have to be, I'm just going to paint a line right here. Now I have 2 sides to this line, right? I have 2 sides. So when people say, oh, get a soft edge, what they're actually saying is get your brush wet with no pigment, and you're going to blend that edge out so we don't really get to see that edge. We know it's there, but it's just a soft edge. And you can even go down as far as you need to, but there's a softer edge to it. The other way you could do that is you can paint a line. Let's say here's our line, and let's say I want a softer edge on the top. I can just kind of blur it away that way to the edge of the, and then we have a lost and found edge like this. Something like that. So the edges are also very important to practice, and I think that we can really learn a lot through our edges. We can also drag this way, and there's a hard edge. So there's lots of ways to use edges. I like to paint an edge, and then I'll just add some water just right there and just let it do its thing. And I like to do that with lots of my landscape elements. Any kind of like water, sky, trees, grasses, you name it. Edges are so important to master. And so really that's the difference between a hard edge and a soft edge. And lost and found edges, you can get lost in playing with your edges in your watercolor. All right, the next technique to master is your wet into wet. And what I mean is, if I were to draw a circle, here's my really wet circle. You can kind of see it, right? I have water on my paper. It's wet. I'll make it even wetter so it will really move. And I'm going to take, it does not matter. This is probably like a milky-ish, it's more buttery. And it's just going to move on the paper. I might have used too much, but it just kind of flows. You can see the pigment flowing, right? That is a wet into wet technique. And I can even go in here. I cleaned out my brush, but I still had pigment on it. That's why I love using two-bit watercolor, is because I wasn't planning on that. I thought my pigment was clean, but again, and then I can drop in if I need to and just make it darker or lighter, whatever. And that's always a fun technique. A lot of people use that for animals, underpaintings, lots of ways. I mean, people use wet into wet all the time just to get a nice watercolor. Like you can even take some out of it. That's called erasing or flooding it and then taking it out. Dry brush is another technique. That's usually a finishing technique. So you usually use like a milk or a buttery, and I usually like to use I use dry brush two different ways. I like to use it for like grass or any kind of texture, right? And you can use that with any brush. I just press my bristle and look at that, I get some beautiful tall grass. Or like if you're doing like texture for a piece of bark or ocean, you can take the barrel of your bristle and just move across the page like that and get some just get the texture of the paper. So that is always a wonderful technique to use. A flat wash is one of my favorites to use when I'm looking for something simple to paint. And I'm just going to get I'm going to get a whole bunch of water in my little cap right here. And a flat wash, if I wanted to do the whole square, I would just go back and forth with the same amount of water and pigment. So I want to get a nice good petal, and I'll just keep going until I run out. And so you want to make sure you have all the petal. You want to make sure that you have enough to do the size that you want. And that is a flat wash right there, and it'll dry pretty flat. A gradient wash is a little, not tricky, it's just different. And what you're doing is, I just added some more pigment, but you're going to take like a milky, buttery type consistency, And I'll just start right up here. See how thick and beautiful that pigment is? Oh, I just love it. Alright, and then I'm going to get my brush wet, and I'm going to go back in, and this pigment is going to just follow the water, and I'm not adding any more pigment, I'm just adding water, and eventually you get this nice gradient. Look, this is great for skies and for, I don't know, when you want a nice gradient. I use this a lot in cards, especially if I want just a simple background. And then I'll just keep going with no extra pigment on my brush. The only pigment I added was at the very top. And I will, for this one, I want to go all the way to the edge of the paper, always, so the water covers all of it. Alright, so that's gradient. And then for variegated wash, you actually want another color. And I did not bring an extra color, so I will show you. A variegated wash, usually you like to use colors that complement. So if I have purple, maybe I want to do a red or a pink. Probably not green, that will make mud. But let's do this cobalt turquoise. This is one of my favorites, and I think that will look really pretty actually with. And this is also a fun way to play with your colors if you're not sure how your color combinations work. And you don't need very much. I'm just going to use a tiny bit. Sometimes that's probably enough. I love Paul Rubens watercolors. They are one of the best entry-level watercolors I have had in a long time. Alright, so I'm just gonna, this is fun. I always like making little backgrounds with variegated washes. I do this all the time. Gina Haynes also does it. She calls it color play or energy washes. But the real name for it is just a variegated wash. And you do this with Janet Rogers. I don't know if she's a floral and portrait artist. She's an American Signature watercolor member. She will do this all the time for her warm-ups too. But so we just add watercolor wherever we feel like it with water. And then we see how they act. And I can tell that the cobalt turquoise that I chose really doesn't, like, it's very light compared to the purple. But there's a variegated wash. And there's no trick to it other than that you just play and you see what you like. You don't want any hard edges, and you just want it to be soft and flowy, like think of a sky or an ocean, something very like ambiguous. Alright, and then the last thing that I like to do, that I like to learn when I'm just starting out, is there's a technique called flooding, and I use this a lot for flowers. So if I'm going to make a cute little, let's say, some kind of circular cute flower. I don't know what kind of flower it is. Maybe it's a violet, a pansy. It looks kind of like a pansy. So there's my pigment. Now I can take my water. My brush is clean, just has water on it, and I'm going to add some of that water to it. I'm going to let it kind of sit there, I don't know, a couple of seconds, it doesn't matter. And then I'm going to dry my brush. My brush is dry. I have my washcloth right here that I can just soak up along the edges, and I get this really pretty floral look that I couldn't have gotten any other way. And now if I wanted to, maybe I want to center, maybe I want a little bit more blue in the center, I can do that, and it won't overpower the flower, and it's really pretty. A lot of people will do this with irises. So that is one way. And but brush strokes, I like using a brush that has a long barrel and a long bristle. So what I mean is that it will hold a lot of water, and I like to do calligraphy, and so I will practice my little loops. I call these loops. I think there's other names for them, but loops or hills. I can go really light and very thick. I can also make little marks like this. I can make little asterisks, but I like to play with my brush so I know exactly what my brush can do. And that way, because when you buy different brushes, you don't always know how thick the tip is going to be. So just taking a couple minutes to get used to your brush can really help. And I also like to see like how much pressure I can get with the bristle. So if I wanted to, my brush is still dry. I need it to be wet and fluid. Alright. I can say, oh, okay, I can get about I don't know, almost an inch from this bristle. And that helps me with landscapes. That could help me with painting different animals, lots of different ways. So anyways, I hope this was helpful. I'm always up for lots of fun techniques, but these 8 have really helped me in my watercolor journey, and I hope that they will help you practice your water to pigment ratio and your edges. Those will get you the furthest. And then when you are feeling a little bit more at ease with your watercolor, then I would play with dry brush and your flat wash and your gradient and your variegated wash, and I think you'll be very, very happy. And I always like to use 2 watercolor paints because that will give me the best darkest values and the lightest values possible. You can get the same kind of with cake pans, but not as easy as you can with 2 watercolors, and that's why I always go with 2 watercolors. So anyways, I hope this helps, and we will talk to you soon.